we're going to start with a question from Tiffany.
Okay.
How would you respond to someone referring to God as, quote, she in a prayer during a church service? And would you say anything to a leader who tells people before a worship song that they can, quote, use whichever pronoun you're comfortable with?
Well, I guess there are two items here. One is the she regarding God. Is this a leader or is just someone in the church?
It says, well, she says, what would you say to a leader who tells people before a worship song they can use whichever
I was
pronoun?
thinking of the first one where
That's
the
unclear.
reference to God was she.
In a prayer during a church service. So obviously somebody who's up there.
What I was going to say is if somebody says she in a church service in a prayer, I probably would not make a fuss. I have a real problem with that. But sometimes you have to judge in a circumstance whether it's worth making a fuss about or not. And if this was an isolated circumstance, I'd probably let it lie. I wouldn't certainly make a federal case out of it, an official complaint. Although I might ask the individual, why did you, in private, in a genial manner, why did you refer to God as she? When God refers to himself as a he, which is the key here. And I don't think anybody who's really thoughtful about this thinks that God is gendered. But if God chooses to call himself Father and refer to himself as he, then I think we ought to go, as we say at Stand to Reason, go with the, well, not pronouns, go in the case, never mind that part. If that's the way God refers to himself, then we ought to refer to God the way he refers to himself, since he is the appropriate authority. All right? It's different when it's human beings, because human beings are gendered by nature, and then to use a pronoun that's inconsistent with their sex is basically living according to a lie and disregarding what God has done. And this is especially critical in an environment, a cultural environment, where this is kind of a movement to disregard the way God has created things. So it's important that way. So I think I would not make a big fuss about it, but if I wanted to say something, I might want to say, why did you do that? If it's a one-off especially, I might just let it go. If it happens on a more regular basis, I'm going to say, why do you keep doing that? Why is it that you use... And because I am curious why that is, particularly when God doesn't do that to himself. And then the second thing has to do with the pastor who says you can use whatever genders you want regarding other people or regarding God.
No, the leader tells people before a worship song. So it's in the context of the worship song that they will be singing.
And genders applying to who?
I assume to God.
Okay, so now you have two incidents in the same church where you have one person doing basically what the leadership said it was okay for her to do, except she's doing it in a prayer. And then people can do that. This represents to me significant confusion. And maybe confusion isn't even the right word, because I don't think the people... I would be surprised if people are genuinely confused about the appropriate way to address God biblically, given that God uses male pronouns to describe himself. I think this is maybe reflects a church-wide, leadership down, point of view or understanding about the role of pronouns in conversation. And what they're doing is they're going along with the world's assessment of pronouns instead of going along with the biblical example of the use of pronouns. That's what it seems like to me. That to me is really serious. Not that he, her, it's not like a huge sin to refer to God as him, but rather as her, or whatever you want to refer to God as. But that this is a statement coming from the leadership indicates a complicity or a bending to the will of the culture. Why would anybody recommend that? What is going on with the pastor to make this recommendation that, and by the way, it seems to me, given this recommendation, the woman who's praying then feels comfortable referring to God as a her. Why not refer to God as an it, if that makes you feel more comfortable? We have a fairly straightforward standard in Scripture, God's use of pronouns regarding himself. We should stick with that. And people who choose not to stick with that, especially leadership who doesn't stick with it, encourages other people that they don't have to stick with it. What's motivating that? What's motivating that, as far as I could tell, is something that has to do with culture and kind of a going along with a narrative that is contrary to the truth of God, and not just contrary to the truth of God with regards to God's own self-reference in gender language, and also with human genders that God created in a certain way. Instead of going with that, we're going to go with the culture. Why?
I think the key as to why comes at the end of this question when the leader said you can use whichever pronoun you are comfortable with. And I think what the key thing is that people want a different God. They want a feminine God. They want maybe they have been hurt by men, or maybe they desire more feminine qualities, or maybe they're just saying, well, look, God has some feminine qualities, so therefore it's okay to call him a she. But the problem is we don't get to make God comfortable for us. Mm-hmm. That's not our call. We want to know the true God. We're not trying, if you are creating your own God that makes you comfortable, then you no longer have the true God. Mm-hmm. And what good is that God to you? Yeah. I mean, to me, it is so disrespectful to God when you ignore the way that he reveals himself to make him into someone that's comfortable to you. I think it goes so deep into the question of, what are you here to do? Are you here to find the true God and to worship him? Or are you here to make yourself feel good and to do certain things that make you feel good, or have certain ideas about God that make you comfortable? There's something deeply wrong with that. There's something at the core of what's happening in that church that I think has gone very wrong.
Right.
They're not actually seeking the true God. Because if you're seeking the true God, you will worship him and you'll refer to him the way he referred to himself.
Yeah.
Now, it could be they don't trust the Bible, that's a revelation. Again, that's another really bad sign for the church. If either you don't think that God is a certain way, but that we can kind of craft our idea of God, or you think the Bible's not an accurate revelation of God. Either way, there is a big problem with this church.
Right. I was just thinking if there were, I mean, I don't pull rank around here, and give orders and stuff like that. I mean, characteristically, but as president. But if I were to do that and give a directive, and I feel strongly about this and I want this done, and somebody said to me, "Yes, ma'am." See, you can't see Amy's face, but she's grinning like holding back. That's sounds so ridiculous, because that would be an insult. That would be an insult to my authority if somebody said that, even if they felt more comfortable doing that. God has identified himself with male pronouns. I think male pronouns communicate a peculiar kind of authority and strength. All right? People might disagree, whatever. But I think that's what it does. Somebody might be offended by that. Well, okay, then why? Because of toxic masculinity? Not all men are toxic. Not all masculinity is toxic. God's masculinity, the one he ascribes to himself, is not toxic. So why can't we just use the language that seems appropriate for God, since he used it for himself, which I think does communicate a stronger sense of authority than mother, ma'am, her.
Well, the fact is, even if we, and I think you're right about that, even if we had no idea of why God used male pronouns. Now, obviously, he wanted to be personal. He didn't want to use it, so he had to use one or the other. Even if we had no idea, we should trust that there's a reason. But I think the reason you've given is valid. I think God did want to communicate certain things about himself through using a masculine pronoun. And ironically, if people want to change the pronoun because they want to emphasize other aspects of God, hopefully I can explain what I'm saying here because this is going to be complicated. But if we were to continue to call God he, and we see all the wide aspects of who he is, that actually redeems masculinity. But if you deny it and you call him a she, now you've lost that ability to define what masculinity is. I mean, Jesus was gentle. Jesus was sacrificial. Jesus was a servant to others. All of these things help define our masculinity. What if we started calling Jesus a she?
Yeah.
Now we're saying a man can't be those things, so we have to call him a she?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It doesn't make any sense. Masculinity can embrace these other qualities, and God does that perfectly. So I think in every way, I think it's just a big mistake for anyone to do this.
Is it Psalm 91 that talks about God covering us with his pinions? Now, those are feathers, and it's a picture of a hen spreading her wings over chicks to protect them. So you have a feminine reference to God's protection. I pray that for my family. I say, God, cover my family with your pinions. I'm totally comfortable with using a more feminized characterization that's biblical while still speaking to God as Father. There's no problem with that at all. So it isn't as if I'm or classical Christians are uncomfortable with the feminine. We just are speaking about God the way God speaks about himself, and that's important, it strikes me. And if somebody is uncomfortable with that, the problem isn't with God. The problem may be with experience that people had, which we can be sympathetic to bad experiences, but we don't, or maybe a cultural influence, but that doesn't justify us changing changing the way we address God. Jesus says, pray this way, our Father. He doesn't say our mother. So if we're speaking to her in a prayer, we can't exactly make reference to the Father. We can't be calling the Father a her. That makes no sense. We have to be referring to God the Mother and then referring to him as her. But Jesus said Father, not Mother. So how are you going to mix them? Well, of course you can mix the pronouns nowadays because of what people are doing with it. But this is all part of not just the confusion, but the sickness. The sickness of the way that people have approached this issue.
And what's ironic is that usually somebody who is insisting on calling God mother is the same kind of person that would be very careful to use someone's preferred pronouns.
Interesting.
So maybe you could simply say, why won't you use God's preferred pronouns?
Pronoun. Yeah. That's a good point.